Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain a little bit more about fiscal policy. In my previous videos, I explained what fiscal policy is, the types of fiscal policy we have, the types of discretionary fiscal policy. So watch those videos first. In this video, my goal is here to show you some graphs. And I'm going to start with expansionary fiscal policy. Just as a reminder, remember that fiscal policy is nothing but the change in the tax or change in the government spending, or G. So I'm going to explain expansionary fiscal policy here, but you can also think about the other type, which is contractionary fiscal policy, which is exactly the opposite of expansionary fiscal policy. As I explained in the previous video, expansionary fiscal policy is designed basically to increase the aggregate demand, and the government actually implements expansionary fiscal policy whenever we have recession. Due to, let's say, COVID-19. So the economy is slow. So to boost the economy, the government has two options here: to reduce taxes, provide tax cut, or spend more money, increase the G. So these are the options that the government has, okay? And we know from our previous chapters that every time that there is an increase in G, the aggregate demand will go up directly. And whenever we have a tax cut, remember that the tax cut will change our disposable income, which is our income after tax. So when there is a tax cut, it means that you have actually more money to spend. So your income after tax, or your disposable income, will go up. So reduction in tax and also government spending can both increase the aggregate demand. So the goal here for this expansion, implementing the expansionary fiscal policy, is to increase the aggregate demand. That's the goal of the government. And again, we have the expansionary fiscal policy here because we have recession. So let me write it down. So we are trying to deal or fight with recession. And remember, whenever we have recession, it means that there is a gap between the actual GDP and the potential GDP. We have a recessionary gap because the aggregate demand is low. So let me draw our aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we have our price level here, which is the price of all the goods and services in the economy. And then we have our real GDP. This is our upward slope aggregate supply. If you don't recall aggregate demand, aggregate supply, definitely review chapter 12. And our aggregate demand is somewhere here. So this is our kind of original aggregate demand number one, I'm gonna call it, okay? So right now the economy is slow, we have recession, so our equilibrium is somewhere here, okay? And our real GDP is somewhere here. This is our real GDP number one. This is our P star one. Okay, or you can look at the lecture notes. I put also an example with a graph with a numerical example. Same thing. I'm just using letters here. Real GDP. I'm just going to label my price as P star one and my output real GDP number one. So right now we have recession. The equilibrium is here. Now the government is implementing the expansionary fiscal policy. Remember we talked about the tax multiplier or the government expenditure multiplier. So we're basically saying that the aggregate demand will go up because of the changes in tax or the government is spending step by step. The aggregate demand doesn't go up overnight. It takes time for the aggregate demand to kind of adjust and change and respond to the changes in taxes and government spending. So when the government increases its own spending or when the government provides tax cut, the aggregate demand will increase. So there will be some rightward shifts in our aggregate demand. So our aggregate demand will be somewhere here. So this is our aggregate demand, let's say number 2, or you can say that the aggregate demand 1 plus some minor changes, a delta E in our aggregate demand, our original aggregate demand. Right now, aggregate demand went up. Look at the new equilibrium. Our new equilibrium will be somewhere here. So our real GDP is going up. It means that people have more income to spend. So then in the next step, our consumption spending will go up because people have more money, so they are going to spend more. So one more time, our aggregate demand will shift to the right. So we have another aggregate demand, or you can say this is our aggregate demand again, number 1 plus another change to, I missed it, another change in aggregate demand. And you can think about again, at the new equilibrium, again, the real GDP is higher than before. So again, people have more income because again, real GDP is the total income of a country. So they have more money to spend. So aggregate demand again will go up, okay? So aggregate demand is shifting to the right step by step till we are at the full employment. So let's say if I increase the aggregate demand twice, I have, of course, we have so many shifts in aggregate demand in between AD1, AD2, and AD3, okay? But let's say AD3 is our ideal aggregate demand. So if we change the aggregate demand by this much, and we are at aggregate demand number 3, our real GDP will be equal to our potential GDP. So it means that we are at full employment, because remember how we define full employment? Full employment happens when the economy produces the amount of output which is equal to potential GDP. So we are at full employment. The government was able to increase the aggregate demand and help the economy to recover from recession. Because down here we had recession because aggregate demand was just too low. If this is our potential GDP, we had this gap between potential GDP and the real GDP. We had this much recessionary gap. But right now with expansionary fiscal policy and the gradual changes in aggregate demand, we were able, or the government was able to eliminate this recessionary gap, and the government was able to lead the economy toward full employment. So at full employment, there is no recessionary gap here, right? So because we had recession, tax cut, or increasing government spending, both can increase the aggregate demand. And this is how the aggregate demand is changing. You can think about the contractionary fiscal policy. When the government tries to reduce the aggregate demand, the goal is to reduce the aggregate demand because we have inflation. The government is trying to deal with inflation. So the government goal will be to reduce the aggregate demand. And aggregate demand will go down if the government increases taxes. So basically the government will take away more money from people, so they have less money to spend. So consumption expenditures right away will go down. And also the government tries to reduce its own size, so the government spending will go down. So contractionary fiscal policy is when the aggregate demand is going down. How? By increasing taxes and reducing government spending. Try to look at the graph, of course, on lecture notes, but also try to redraw the graph for yourself and try the opposite case, contractionary fiscal policy. I hope that you find this video helpful.